Hey, what's up, you guys? The Curious Owl here, and welcome to my April wrap-up. So April was the Owls month this year, and it was a crazy month in general because I had been preparing to move, and in the beginning of May we actually ended up moving. So it was very stressful, but I'm actually so happy to say that I was able to complete my Owls. I wasn't able to film though the last couple weeks of April because I was really stressed with trying to move, and filming during that time was getting to be really stressful, and especially editing because those vlogs were getting to be really long because I like to talk, if you guys don't know. So those vlogs just took up a lot of time that I didn't really have, unfortunately, with trying to pack and trying to also decompress and still work and stuff like that. So it was kind of just nuts, but I did, like I said, end up finishing my Owls. So let's get into what exactly I read. So in total this month I finished 9 books, and I did have 1 DNF, so I kind of went through a total of 10 books over the course of the month. Most of them were for my Owls, but I did read 1 extra book after I finished my Owls that was for my Morganville reading series, which I will get to later. Over the course of the month I had 3 5-star books, 3 4-star books, and 3 3-star books. So it was a pretty decent month other than my DNF, which I just really hated the book that I was reading and I couldn't stand it. So I actually ended up deciding to unhaul it, but I will get to that a little bit later with what it was and why I didn't like it. Then to go into my stats for the month, I ended up reading a total of 2,797 physical pages. And I actually didn't listen to any audiobooks this month, which was a surprise. The problem was I didn't find any audiobooks that would work for any of the books that were on my Owls TBR, so I didn't really have a chance to. And then because I was trying to focus so much on my Owls, I just didn't listen to any audiobooks. I was more just wanting to focus on those physical books. So it was really weird though, but I am actually getting back into my audiobooks here this month. So that makes me really happy. But I had 0 minutes of audiobooks listened to. 8 of the books I read this month were physical. I had 1 ebook and 0 audiobook. All of the books I read this month too were for my own personal library, so I had none borrowed this month, which was actually kind of cool, but that's also because the libraries are completely closed, and the only time I would actually be able to use my library right now would be through Overdrive, and I didn't really have anything that I could borrow from Overdrive at the moment because my library lottery book for April actually was already a book I had in my physical library. I didn't actually get to it, but I didn't actually have to borrow anything this month, which was kind of weird. Okay, so now let's go into what exactly the books I read this month were. And like I said, the majority of them were for my Owls, and I did have 1 book that was outside of that. But let's get through the books that I read for the Owls first. The first one was Tell Me 3 Things by Julie Buxbuam. This was for my Owl for Ancient Runes, which was to read a book that had either the word heart in the title or a heart on the cover, and obviously there's one right here. This follows a young girl who is basically being moved from halfway across the country because her father ends up meeting this really affluent woman in the film industry from Los Angeles online after having lost his previous wife due to cancer. And when he kind of actually gets to meet her, he essentially picks up his daughter and moves her all the way to Los Angeles from, I think, the Chicago area. And she is not happy about it one bit. And the school she ends up attending is kind of a little bit more on the affluent side. She doesn't really fit in because she's kind of really one of the poorest students that there are because of where she comes from, even though her father now has married this fairly rich woman, but she just doesn't feel like she really fits in. And it's a school where it's very hard to traverse because there's so many different groups of people. And so she gets an email from someone who claims to be a student at the school who is willing to help her, but they would like to remain anonymous. They don't want her to know who this person is. And so the whole story is really her traversing school and trying to find out who exactly this person is that's emailing her, because she starts to actually kind of become really good friends with them and really wants to know who is willing to step out to make her feel welcome in the school when very many people would not do the same thing. So it's a really sweet story. I actually feel like it's one of those stories where you might predict who it is kind of early on, but you don't really know why, and you don't find out why actually until the end. And actually it's one of the very few YA contemporaries I think I can honestly say I truly loved. And That's really weird for me to say because I feel like I've gotten away from YA contemporaries a lot. I'm not really the audience for that anymore because I'm now going on 23 years old, and these kind of stories don't jive with me anymore. I'm not someone who's looking for a really romantic contemporary. If I look for anything in a YA contemporary, I'm looking for things like family dynamics and friendship dynamics. Like, I am not interested in the romantic aspect anymore. That doesn't mean I don't like romance. That just means I don't think YA romance in particular is something I'm willing to kind of jive with as much as I would for like an adult romance or a romance involved as a subplot in a different genre. But I really did love this a lot, and I ended up giving a 5 out of 5 stars because I just found it to be so endearing. The next book I completed, I actually forgot that I had read because it was something I had started in March and actually had finished in April. It wasn't really part of my Owls per se, but it ended up being something I ended up finishing, and that was Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. This is essentially in the Song of Ice and Fire world that George R.R. Martin has created. It is a prequel story to everything that happens. So this is following the Targaryen bloodline from when they first take over Westeros 300 years prior to the story of Song of Ice and Fire. And this kind of doesn't go through the whole story. It actually goes up to about, I think, 150 or 100 years before Robert Baratheon had taken over the Targaryens, which is essentially what we know of in the very first book of the Song of Ice and Fire series, Game of Thrones. So this is essentially supposed to be an account from a historian of Westeros telling the story about the Targaryens and how they took over and the different kings and queens that had ruled over the kingdom and what they did, what they had gone through, the kinds of things that had been brought up in terms of if they were tyrants or if they were in any kind of extramarital affairs. Very, very detailed description, and I truly enjoyed it. Now, do I think you need to read this in order to get a full grasp of the whole world? I don't think so. This is, I think, a book that is typically for the people who are like the really invested fans of the book series and really want to know about the Targaryens. I think if you're a fan of the show, you wouldn't really get as much out of this. I don't think it would be something that you'd be super interested in, but if you are like a big diehard fan of either the show or the books or both, you might have some fun with this because it does explain a lot about the kinds of things that, like, some of the traditions that are involved in the Song of Ice and Fire series, some of the ceremonies, some of the thoughts about different kinds of people that are involved. Like, it does explain quite a bit in terms of some of the minute details of the world, but it's also just a really cool historical aspect, really seeing how much that Martin has gotten involved with his world, like how much he really built within this world. And there are pictures that were drawn that are essentially depictions of the different rulers, and so that's really cool to see like how these characters might have actually looked back then. It's just one of those stories where I think like you don't need to read it, but if you're a really big fan, you will get a kick out of it because it's something that is going to be really fun for you to see the whole story as opposed to only knowing what happens in the show or only knowing what happens in the first 5 books of the Song of Ice and Fire series. I also gave Fire and Blood a 4 out of 5 stars just because I felt like it did drag in a couple of different places, but that's because I have a hard time sometimes with the language that it's written in, but that's just a personal thing for me. It just made things a little bit confusing at times, but was still very enjoyable. The next book I actually did read for my Owls was With the Fire on High by Elizabeth Acevedo. This was for my Arithmancy course, which was to read a book that was outside of my favorite genre. Now, my favorite genre is fantasy, and contemporary is the complete opposite of that. So I thought reading another contemporary would be really fun. This is another YA contemporary I think is like something I would really like because this focuses not on a romantic element in the slightest. Like, there's a part of it that deals with a romance, but this is a story that follows a teen mom and essentially her trying to finish her senior year of high school and figuring out what she wants to do with her life after high school. So it is so much more enticing. I feel like my thing with YA contemporary is I like to see coming of age stories, and I like to see things that deal with like family dynamics or a character that has some kind of issue, whether it's their race or their gender or their sexual identity or something about them that is against the norm and how they work within the world because of it. And this, I think, is a story that I think is so important because it touches a lot on what it's like to be a teen mom. Now, I had a lot of friends who end up being very young mothers, not necessarily teen moms, but very young mothers just getting out of high school. I did have a couple friends who were teen moms, and I never really understood how they might have gone through finishing school or whatever. And this really brought a huge light to that. And it deals with a main character who is both Black and Hispanic. And just to see the differences between myself and the main character Amani in terms of like upbringing and culturality and just being a mother in general as opposed to being a teen mom by itself. It was so interesting, and I feel like her relationships were the big thing for me because, like I said, my big thing with contemporaries is I love seeing family dynamics. Imani lives with her grandmother, who is pretty much the person who raised her from the time she was born, because unfortunately for her, her mother had died in childbirth, and then her father, who was not really ready to be a parent, essentially abandoned her and only sees her once a year ever since she's been born. And so she doesn't really have a good relationship with her father. Her grandmother, though, is the one who raised her. And so she's learned a lot about her cultural heritage and has learned a lot about being a good human being from her grandmother. And I just adore her abuela. She is so sweet. When Hamani had gotten pregnant her freshman year of high school, her grandmother stopped everything to help her take care of her child. She wanted to help Amani the best she could, but because her grandmother also is disabled, has a kind of physical disability, Imani kind of realized that her grandmother wouldn't be around forever. And so a lot of the story is her trying to find a way to move on with her life, especially because she knows that eventually she will be on her own. And so she wants to make a good life for herself and for her daughter for when her grandmother's not around. There's a lot that goes on with it, but that's kind of the gist that I want to give with this, because I feel like you really need to experience this for yourself, especially if you are a white person, because it really delves into a lot of things about race and gender and in general being a teen mom. And I think that especially with the fact that Imani is Black and Hispanic, it adds a whole other layer to that with being a teen mother. And it just opened my eyes, I think, so much more. Like, I had the same feelings for this that I had for The Poet X, which Elizabeth Acevedo also wrote, and the same feelings I had for when I first read The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. Like, these are the YA contemporaries that I like to read because it opens my mind, it gives me a better perspective of things, and it really makes me think about some things that I may not have experienced that I feel like I understand a little bit more now that I've read something from characters who actually have dealt with these things. And they're written by authors that are either in the same position or were in the same position as these characters, or have similar things about them to these characters that they put their experiences in. So it's just, I love this so much. And I had a whole discussion about it in the vlog where I read this. So if you want to hear more of my beautiful thoughts on this book, then you can go watch that vlog. The next book I had read for my owls that I actually ended up replacing because it didn't fit necessarily one of the prompts that I thought it would was Wicked Saints by Emily A. Duncan. This was supposed to be my Defense Against the Dark Arts prompt, which was to read a book set on the sea or at the coast. And I thought that this was going to be at the sea or on the coast, but the two places that were involved in this story were neither. They were much more inland than I had thought they were. So I did end up finishing it though, and I kind of was disappointed by it, but I like it enough to where I want to read Ruthless Gods, which just came out, and I do want to get my hands on it. But I ended up giving this a 3 out of 5 stars because I just felt like it wasn't nearly as dark as people had made it seem to be. I felt like it kind of was just Like, I was expecting like Martin level kind of gore and death and Stephen King horror gore and death, and this was far from that. Like, there was some gore, there was some death, but not nearly to the level I had thought there was going to be. And then when I found out that it didn't actually meet the prompt that I needed, I was really disappointed because I was like, dang it, I wanted to complete this prompt, but I didn't with this. So the one I actually ended up using instead was Siege and Storm by Leigh Bardugo, the second book in the Grisha trilogy. I was also disappointed by this one. I kind of wanted it to be a little bit more. Like, there basically was this really great beginning and really great ending, and the middle was kind of just a lot of nothing except court stuff, and I liked that to an extent, but it wasn't really a whole lot. Like, I felt like a lot of the middle could have been just like condensed, and there wasn't really much else other than court life for Alina in this one, and I understand now why a lot of people don't like this one in the series, because it was just a lot of nothing except for the very beginning and the very end of the book. But this one was the one that ended up completing my owls for Defense Against the Dark Arts, and I ended up giving this one a 3 out of 5 stars as well. So then the next book that I actually did complete a prompt was The End of Oz by Danielle Paige. This is the last book in the Dorothy Must Die series. This is like the last book in the main series. There are 3 collections of short stories that I also will be reading in terms of finishing this series, because they're collections of novellas that did have some importance to the overall world with either explaining other characters or something like that. But this was the last book in the main series. This was to complete my owl for Transfiguration, which was to read a book that involved a shapeshifter, and this one does include a character that is a shapeshifter. He's not really seen a lot. He's seen more so in this one than he was in the last book in the series, but there's not a lot of shapeshifting that does happen, but he is a character that is proven to shapeshift. This is, like I said, the culminating end of the Dorothy Must Die series, so I don't want to go too much into it because it will spoil a lot of the book, but essentially what does happen is this picks up essentially after the events of Yellow Brick War, where Amy Gum and Knox, and a character that we meet very briefly in the first book but plays a bigger role in the third book, that is from Amy's past life in Kansas. They are all stuck in essentially like this deserted area that is like unknown to many people. It's called the Kingdom of Ev, and this is where kind of the big bad guy that comes up in Yellow Brick War is from. It's kind of this desolate area that is without magic. It's very, very different from what Oz was, and this kind of goes into a lot about the other side of things, because Oz is typically a place that we know of as having magic and being a good place. Ev is kind of like the opposite of that, and so we learn a lot about this character that comes up in Yellow Brick War called the Gnome King, and what he has in store now that Dorothy is supposedly gone from this world. We don't know for sure. Things kind of at the end of Yellow Brick War came to a point where we weren't really sure if she was really dead, and the story really kind of delves into what the Gnome King has in store for Oz now that it seems to be that he could get into control of it. And Amy essentially has to figure out a way to bring him down now, because it's like the next boss battle. He's kind of more of the ultimate boss battle though in terms of the story. I was really disappointed in this one though too, because I felt like, for one, it was super rushed. I feel like the last 2 books of the series really could have been combined into one larger book, because I really liked a lot of what the second book, The Wicked Will Rise, did, where it was very action-packed. There was a lot of action going on at one time, and there was some action that was involved in both Yellow Brick War and The End of Oz, but not enough to where I felt like it really did anything for the story. I feel like it would have been better to have seen these 2 books combined so that we had a more action-packed story. And while the story and the plot itself were actually pretty good, and the characters I feel like had grown a lot over the course of the story, I just felt like in terms of an ending, this was kind of disappointing, and I would have preferred it to maybe be a 3-book series so that the action-packedness of the story would have been more impactful as opposed to what it was in both of these stories. And I feel like though the ending of this in general was pretty cool. I like the way that the story had kind of continued and what exactly had happened to Amy at the very end of it. I don't think I was really disappointed with the whole ending of it in general, but I think in terms of like wanting there to be a lot of action and a lot of like fights going on that I would have expected from an ending like this, it was kind of disappointing, kind of rushed, kind of too short, I think, for what it should have been, and I think it should have just been combined with book 3. And this one I ended up giving a 3 out of 5 stars as well. The book that I ended up actually DNFing, and because I DNF'd it, ended up not counting for the prompt it was meant for, was The Black Witch by Laurie Forrest. Now, I know a lot of people on BookTube absolutely hate this book, and I don't know if it's for the same reasons that I don't like it, but this was supposed to be for my History of Magic course, which was to have a book that contains something about witches or wizards. Now, this is following a young woman who essentially is whisked off from her little farmland hometown to the big city, where she's going to learn to be a apothecary. But she is actually supposedly the descendant of a really powerful black witch that was super, super important in terms of the history of this world, and everyone is expecting her to be just like her grandmother because she looks exactly like her, and she looks like she may have some possible similar powers to what her grandmother had in the past. But this girl doesn't really want that. She doesn't really want anything to do with that. And so she ends up going to university to study to be an apothecary instead. What I didn't like about this book was like the first 70 pages was pretty okay. But then we met a character who basically made this into like a high school drama story. This character basically, from the minute she meets the main character, it was like, this girl's gonna try to steal my guy because she's supposedly, you know, the granddaughter of some really important witch, and I need to protect him at all costs because she is not right for him. I'm right for him. I don't want her near him, so I'm gonna make her life a living hell. Complete high school drama. I was not up for it. I was so put off by it that within 70 pages of this book, I just DNF'd it because I was like, nope, I am not going to sit here for this long of a book if that's all that's going to be. Now, it may have been that might not have been the whole course of the book, but I was not up for it and I was not willing to put myself through that just because of the amount of stuff that had already happened that was high school drama like. And I said, nope, yeet. So the one I ended up replacing the Black Witch for in terms of my History of Magic book was the second collection from Amanda Lovelace, which is The Witch Doesn't Burn in this one. And now it's not a literal witch that we're talking about with this poetry collection. This is a collection of poetry that basically just talks about how women in general over the course of time have been looked at as kind of either dangerous or something to that effect, and then also at the same time that we are like weak, and that if we do things that essentially invoke the wrath of men, that we are, you know, dangerous people. And it talks a lot about things like rape, sexual assault, and essentially the lack of control that women have in terms of power, because men in the past have really taken advantage of women, and especially during like the Salem witch trials, women who went against the norm or went against what men thought were supposed to be normal in terms of societal standards, they were looked at as dangerous and were considered witches back then. And so then they would either be burned at the stake or drowned or subjected to any other forms of torture in order to get them to admit that they were witches. When in reality, it was a lot of times women who were looked at because they were different and abnormal to the societal standards that men had placed, because they lived in a patriarchy, and we still live in a patriarchy in a lot of ways in today's society. And we are still, a lot of times, women subjected to forms of harassment and torture because of things that we do or things that we don't do. And this is a poetry collection that really kind of just speaks to a lot of that stuff, and how essentially we as women should be able to take the power back, and how we can really just stand up for ourselves, and how we need to stand up for ourselves, because if we don't, no one is going to do it for us. Like, we have to do it for ourselves because ain't nobody else gonna do it. So it's a really powerful collection. Now, my issue with it though is that kind of the same issue I had with Ruby Cower is it's instant poetry. It's very short. There's a lot of white space involved with this, and I'm not necessarily a fan of that style, but I will read it. And there are a lot of really good poems in this that are short and really fun and really do pack a big punch when it comes to discussing certain topics. Now, it's just not my favorite form of poetry, but I like Amanda enough to where I think that I will keep her collections regardless, because I do like a lot of what her messages are. The next book I actually ended up reading was another of Amanda Lovelace's poetry collections, and that was Break Your Glass Slippers. This is her brand new poetry collection that just got released in early March. This is part of a new collection of that is essentially going into like fairy tale stories. Very similar, where it's instant poetry, but this is kind of dealing more on a story kind of style, where the poems essentially are written in a way that reminds you of like Cinderella. And Amanda says in the very beginning of the collection that she wants you to place yourself in the shoes of Cinderella, because through that you will understand the poems a little bit better, and how every person who reads this, every young woman who reads this and has experienced something similar to what the poems individually talk about, they can see themselves as Cinderella because they have gone through something. Like, there's a lot that talks about like fat phobia, and how there's sometimes very toxic relationships that women can get themselves involved with, where they're trying to get the love of somebody that they feel like they admire or that they love, but that person is not reciprocating, and they feel they either take advantage of that person, or they're only using them for a specific purpose, like their body or something in regards to that, and they don't actually love them. This is kind of a poetry collection where it asks you really to find something in it that you may connect with. And if you do, you can connect to any other person. You can connect to the character of Cinderella because you have experienced something to the effect of what she may have experienced if we were to look at her in a way that is a little bit more deeper as opposed to what the Disney story really showcases. I think I like this one a lot more than I did The Witch Doesn't Burn in this one, mainly because I feel like I just connected to a lot of the poems a lot more. Now, that's not to say I didn't really connect with anything that was in The Witch Doesn't Burn in this one. I heavily connected to a lot of the poems in them, but I think I just like the structure a little more in terms of the story. Like, there were very clear sections of the story as opposed to The Witch Doesn't Burn in this one, but I still am not a huge fan of the instant poetry style, and I felt like there was way too much white space within this. It's just a weird thing for me. I don't know. It's a personal preference, I guess. But I did really actually enjoy this one. And actually for both of these collections, I gave them a 4 out of 5 stars. I think though, in terms of enjoyment, I think I enjoyed Break Your Glass Slippers a little bit more. And the last book I ended up completing this month was my Morganville reread for this past month, April, which was Fall of Night. Now, this is book 14 in the series. It is by far probably now my favorite in the series. I thought Ghost Town was going to be my favorite of the series with this reread, but I think Fall of Night right now is now my favorite because this, I think, showcased so much how Rachel Kane's writing had grown over the series, because it went from being very juvenile in the very first few books of the series to then getting to be much more complex when we got to around the Ghost Town area, where things started to become a lot more dire. There were more plot points being developed and a lot of more things being divulged about the town itself of Morganville. And then this one, it opened up a whole new plot in terms of how there is a company that is looking to kill off the vampires that may have ties to certain groups of people in Morganville that are looking to get rid of the vampires in general. And it's a really big plot point I remember so vividly from the first time I read this series. But I think that I enjoyed it so much more because in this book, what we find out is that Claire essentially has been accepted to MIT, which is a college that she really wanted to get into when she first had graduated high school. But in the beginning of the series, her parents had wanted her to go to a more local college because it was going to be really hard for them to be able to let their 16-year-old daughter move all the way across the country to go to MIT. So they made her go to Morganville instead, which is where the whole story really takes off from. But in Bitter Blood, the last book, she gets a call from MIT saying, hey, we would like to accept you for the new semester. We need your information, all this stuff. And she was really hesitant to go because of all of the things that she had done in Morganville for the last 2 years up to this point. And so the end of the last book, we find out that essentially she ends up going to MIT. And in this book, it's a lot of her trying to make a new life for herself in MIT because things are very different for her. Her family's not there, Shane's not there, Eve and Michael aren't, and she's actually away from Myrnin, which is a really weird thing for her. So she goes there mostly to be able to actually work with a professor who used to live in Morganville. Myrnin essentially sends her off to MIT to work with something that they had started working with in the last book, I think, or the book before, a very specific project, and he wants her to go and enrich herself and learn more from this doctor that he knows than he could ever teach her. And unfortunately for her, things are not as what they seem when they go to MIT, as is like most of the Morganville vampire books. There are things that are nefarious that are happening, and she gets caught in the middle of it. And I can't really say much more than that, otherwise I will spoil the book. But I will say that I feel like this one really showcased Rachel's growth in a lot of ways. It showed that she has really taken her characters and had us grow up with them over the course of the series, because the entirety of the series follows 3 or 4 years of Claire's life, and it is so stunning to see at this point in the series how complex the story has gotten, how developed the characters have gotten over the course of the 15-book series at this point, and how intricate she has made Morganville, despite how weird it might have seemed from the very first few books. I just feel like this is one of those books that just exemplifies, especially since it's near the end of the series, it just really exemplifies what Rachel has done, and it really makes me happy to see that. I love one of the last few books because I think that it shows a lot of promise for what the very last book will be, which is Daylighters, and I'm very excited to finally finish the series this month in May. So if you guys have been participating in that read along, let me know and what your thoughts of A Fall of Night were, and I don't know, we'll see kind of what happens in Daylighters, I guess. Without having to really say much, I gave that one a 5 out of 5 stars, as it is now my most favorite book in the entire series. Yeah, that was all the books I read in April. I'm actually really proud of myself because the month did go really, really fast for me, and it was very stressful a lot of times. So I'm actually really proud of myself that not only I finished my Owls, but I actually read a couple other books that I ended up either starting in March or had started in the month and was able to finish in the month. So that's good for me. So anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me in this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you're not already and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all you guys in my next video. Bye guys.